Always proud to present Dr. Pat Snowdon.
Hello, and I'm very happy to speak to you today about some research that the Forestry Commission in the UK has commissioned recently into assessing the cost effectiveness of planting new woodlands as a way of abating CO2 emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions abatement is an important policy objective for us, as is woodland creation, and this work is trying to improve the evidence base that we can use with other government departments and other organisations in this area. So the study looked at estimating cost effectiveness. It did this by looking at different types of woodlands that we would expect to plant across the UK in future years, and it also tried to estimate the potential scale of such abatement, where possible having a regional breakdown, with a view then to putting in place marginal abatement cost curves that we could use for comparison with other abatement technologies. A few points about measuring cost effectiveness. You can see a standard definition of cost effectiveness on the slide. But this study looked at two different measures. The first is a more traditional physical measure, which looks at the cost in net present value terms of abating a tonne of CO2. The second measure is a value measure, which actually compares the cost of abating CO2 to its value. And the advantage of this approach is that it takes into account the value of the CO2 emissions and their timing. And to be cost effective under this value measure, you need to have a value that's less than £1 or €1 per tonne per 1 pound of CO2 delivered. The study took a social perspective, focusing on the value to society of these benefits, rather than that of, say, a private landowner purely, or just in terms of government expenditure terms. And so, to that end, it used the social value of carbon in its estimates. We used a single planting year rather than multiple years to reduce any complexity in the modelling, and that year was 2014. We selected two time horizons, 2050 and 2200. 2050 is an important policy horizon for us because it relates to our emissions targets under the Climate Change Act in the UK. 2200 was thought to be a suitable timescale to reflect the much longer term nature of forestry and the benefits that could be delivered in the long term. We used discount rates in the study based on the UK Treasury rates, and these decline over time. A risk factor was also applied to the carbon estimates to reduce the carbon by 15%. This was considered appropriate in order to take account of any impacts on the woodlands from climatic changes or problems with establishment or pests and disease, etc. And finally, we had to take account of counterfactuals relating to previous land use. It was assumed here that the trees would be planted on permanent pasture rough grazing mainly, and in some cases arable land. The key thing here is this will affect the soils that the woodlands are planted on. The next slide just shows, it sets out the types of forests, woodlands, that the analysis was applied to. And these cover energy woodlands, farm woodlands. We would like to plant more woodlands on farms. And it also looks at a couple of permanent woodland examples based around broadleafs. And then some more productive woodlands where timber and or fuel is taken out of the woodland. And when you're looking at modelling carbon in woodlands, there are a number of different factors which need to be considered, and this slide provides a very brief summary of those. Key things obviously to consider are the sequestration in the woodlands, and this is based for this study on Forest Research carbon models. These are based on the forest growth models, and they will, for different species and different management regimes, provide you with estimates of carbon accumulation in the woodlands over time. We had to take account of any emissions through forest operations, any emissions from timber and wood once they start to decay after their use. And this was based on international guidelines in terms of the half-lives of different types of wood use. We needed to take account of any effects from biomass for construction, for combustion, and also we looked at any benefits from product substitution, whereby you look at substituting timber for construction materials such as steel, which may be more intensive in their production processes in terms of CO2 emissions. We also had to take account of soils, and this is a major issue because this can have a significant impact on the net carbon benefits. A couple of factors there we didn't account for in the study were changes to land use and end-of-life combustion. Or end-of-life combustion referring to combusting wood products when you've actually finished with them at the end of their life. This particular effect was so far into the future that some initial sensitivity analysis suggested it wasn't going to make much of an impact, and it was also quite difficult to link to the main carbon models that we used. In terms of changes to land use, we didn't account for the benefit of ceasing a more greenhouse gas intensive agricultural activity because we weren't sure whether that activity would be displaced elsewhere. So we omitted that from the study. Looking quickly at benefits and costs, you can see that on the benefits side, we took account of carbon using the Department of Energy and Climate Change's social value of carbon. We took account of timber prices, but we excluded public benefits because this was quite a complex area. It's very spatially variable, and we didn't really have the data or resources for this study to include them. On the cost side, we looked at the opportunity costs of planting in terms of agricultural income foregone, and we looked at planting and management costs using data from the forest industry. A few examples then of the results. This is a lowland conifer example in the northeast of England, based around planting Douglas fir on an organo-mineral clay soil. And you can see how the carbon accumulates in the woodland before felling and then drops off again before accumulating in the next cycle. And you can see the emissions that take place following planting and before the sequestration in the trees then starts to correct for that. And over time, over the 186-year period to 2200, this gave a net mean retention of carbon of 288 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. The second example I just wanted to show you quickly is a permanent woodland which is not harvested, and this is based around broadleaves, sycamore, alder, birch and oak, and this is planted on a mineral loam soil. And over the 186-year period, this to 2200, this had a mean retention of 373 tonnes of CO2 per hectare, so a higher level of carbon, as you would expect, because nothing has been removed from the woodland. And to summarise the cost effectiveness, you can see this table, which shows how cost effectiveness varies across the different woodland types. And the broad finding was that the upland and lowland conifer types were the most cost effective. This relates to the growth, the capacity of these trees to grow quickly in certain conditions, and also in the upland case there will be lower opportunity costs associated with agriculture. These are initial findings, so we are still needing to investigate further the reasons for some of these findings and whether we need to look at some more forestry types. In conclusion, the study found that woodland is generally a cost-effective option in the long term. There are major variations according to different forest options. Lowland and upland conifers appear to be the most cost-effective. Under the value measure, interestingly, almost all options were cost-effective. We looked at these two different time horizons, and they do have significant impact on the results. We actually only showed the cost effectiveness for the 2200 figures, not the 2050 figures at this stage. There are various reasons for that, which I'd happily go into if there are any questions about this. In terms of the marginal abatement cost curve, a few estimates have been put together in the study, one of which is that about 6,500 hectares of woodland could be created each year across England, Scotland and Wales at a cost of less than £40 per tonne of CO2, delivering about 1.8 million tonnes of CO2 over their lifetime. There are some short-term constraints for certain species according to their growth rates, and soils. Certain soils also can place a significant constraint on the ability of woodlands to provide a net benefit in this area in the short term. And with regard to that, I think there's more work to do on soil emissions and to get a better understanding of that, and Forest Research is taking that forward, our research agency. The consultants did carry out sensitivity analysis. We assumed that timber prices remained constant, but if they were increased by 1% a year, that did make a significant difference to the cost effectiveness, improving it considerably for woodland types where you harvest timber. In terms of substitution effects, the sensitivity analysis found that there was less impact of assuming that more wood actually substituted for other construction materials such as steel, for example. This is thought to be because the Department of Energy and Climate Change assumes that other industries, by the time these substitution effects take place at the end of the first rotation, that these other industries would have become much more carbon efficient, so the relative gains would have reduced. In terms of the wider benefits of woodlands, these weren't accounted for, as I mentioned. We assume they could have a significant impact because the non-market benefits of forestry are themselves significant, and previous research has shown that. But in conclusion, this has given us some very useful data to start to understand better how different types of woodlands can contribute to CO2 emissions abatement in a cost-effective way, but we do need to carry out more comprehensive modelling. Thank you.